India achieved a historic G20 consensus just a few weeks ago. But ever since the G20 consensus, there's been a diplomatic standoff between India and Canada. To talk about that and a lot more on the changing dynamics of India's foreign policy, we have Samir Saran, a well-known author, but also president of the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you very much, Samir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Aditya.
You saw Justin Trudeau's statement over 2 weeks ago. And ever since, there's been a lot of sloganeering in both these countries. But what was your initial reaction to what Justin Trudeau said inside the House of Commons?
Look, Justin Trudeau was out of line when he made the statement in Parliament speaking about purported Indian activity in Canada, linking Indian agencies to an incident that had occurred in his country. Why was it out of line? First, as relatively friendly countries, many of these conversations are had behind closed doors, even if they have some merit. In this case, very clearly, nothing in the weeks thereafter have suggested to us that there is anything significant in terms of evidence or in terms of concrete circumstantial proof that would make his claims seem to be true. Nothing has been offered in the public domain, barring some leakages around some conversations that may have been recorded. And by the way, any conversation in much of North India, or rather much of India, that you record would have tall claims in them after 6 p.m. So any claims of having captured conversations of people discussing something that would have happened in Canada is bogus, right? And in these circumstances, for him to come and make such a big statement in the Canadian Parliament tells you that either he was pandering to his constituencies, which is most likely the case, or he was responding to his diminished role in world affairs, generally his stature in the G20 itself, and his rather cold treatment in New Delhi during the summit. And I think it's a combination of both. He's beleaguered at home, and clearly all over the world, Trudeau is not seen to be a statesman with weight. So he is trying to, in some sense, hit back, push back, reclaim some space, mobilize his cadres, mobilize his constituency at home. And he decided to make this issue, which he thought could become emotive and could rally the world around him in a new sort of way. It didn't happen. Too bad for him.
As you said, there are a lot of stories doing rounds, perhaps more in the Western press. There's one such story that appeared in US dailies, and this is about Five Eyes intelligence. And a perception was created that the US had in fact shared intelligence with Canada. But soon after, Canada reached out to its G7 partners, its Five Eyes intelligence partners, but nobody condemned India publicly. Nobody decided to in fact come out guns blazing against New Delhi. Why do you think this happened? And do you think from the G20 itself, as you said, Justin Trudeau is standing and he's more so isolated?
Look, I don't know why the Five Eyes didn't rally behind Canada. One reason could be that the real eye is India, and that India matters more than the other eyes in the Five Eyes. And this eye is certainly more important to at least 4 out of the 5 eyes than the fifth eye. And that is clearly a reflection of the politics of our times. That is the first. The second, what was Trudeau trying to justify by making these claims? Was he trying to justify his breeding and incubating terror at home? Was he seeking a sanctuary for producing a terror factory in Canada? This is a very difficult defense. No country in the world that has suffered from terror will condone Canada's permissiveness and use of its territory for activities outside. It is a very difficult claim to defend. He is not an activist. He's a terrorist, the person who was eliminated. If it was and most likely, and in all probability, this operation was a nice old-fashioned gangland fight between two satraps trying to assert control over the constituencies that they have created. They may have been aided and abetted by folks from outside, but this is an inside job. This is a culture that Canada has allowed to be, in many ways, it has allowed it to flourish in the neighborhoods of Toronto, right? So who is going to come and stand with Trudeau in defense of terror? Trudeau and terror do not make a great diplomatic, attraction for any country to come and defend. He's not fighting for climate change. He's not fighting for gender rights. He's not fighting for the global south. He's not fighting for cheaper food for all. He's not fighting for bringing down energy prices and making life affordable to everyone. He's fighting for defending terror at home. Who's going to stand with him? And anyone who stands with him should be exposed and should be actually shamed.
Well, there is truth, there are lies, and then there is Trudeau. But how do you see Foreign Minister Jaishankar's statement, who's spoken continuously over the last few days? He's been very calculated in what he says, but also very firm. He said that organized crime, Khalistani terrorism, and gangland violence has increased and found a safe sanctuary in Canada over the years. We've had 26 dossiers that India has sent over the last decade, but there's been no action whatsoever. And not just this, during the senior Trudeau's time, we had the Kanishka bombing, and even before that, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had shared details with her counterpart. But no lessons learned, no action taken. Why do you think? Do you think that it's merely domestic political compulsion, or do you think there's much more to it?
Look, I think there are a few elements here. That's a long question. The first part is, I think the Indian government has handled this situation very well. They have rightly stated, without any dithering, that this is not Indian state policy. Any responsible state should not be acting outside its sovereign boundaries in extrajudicial manners. So I think they have taken the right, official line, that this is not Indian state policy, and this has been something which has been consistently maintained, and we must maintain this. That's number one. The second, I think they have also been quite guarded in, or rather, they have been restrained in responding to wild allegations and accusations that have been coming out of either official or quasi-official, the Western Godi media, if it was a good title to use. The original Godi media, we should call them the original ones. You know, remember their complicity in everything that has happened around the world and how they have parroted their master's voice. So the original Godi media, if that OGM should be the term we should use today. So India has been quite restrained in responding to the original Godi media that emanates from Western capitals. Having said that, I don't think this is too much of an issue in many parts of the world. Indian Twitter is quite busy with it. Indian social media is quite busy with it. But I've just spent 2 weeks overseas. I was in Vienna, I was in Berlin, I was in New York, I was in DC, and we discussed everything under the sun but Trudeau and his terror factory. Yes, it did come up because, oh, what are you guys doing? You know, it was like a joke. It was like a aside in a dinner conversation that was more about substantive stuff like green transitions and managing the rise of China and aligning the pieces so that you could have connectivity and trade that connects the emerging parts of the world. They were talking about these questions. These were side notes. Indian Twitter and Canadian Twitter have embraced this, but the world is not necessarily engaged in that conversation. It is the Canadian Trudeau's party versus the Indian trolls that are having a conversation. Indian government is also not interested. Even they moved on. Even they are busy with doing other stuff that they need to be doing, right? So that's the first part. That I think Indian government has been restrained, calculated, and has been firm in maintaining what is policy and what is not acceptable. Second, they've also been quite clear that since Trudeau has given us this moment when the spotlight is on Canada's terror underbelly, they have highlighted and they have in a sense used this moment to let the world know that this is a long-standing Indian grouse and complaint and in fact a significant misdemeanor on part of Canada to have allowed this culture of gangland violence and terror factories and petty politics create a heady mix that elects Trudeau and reduces the status of Canada in the world. I think this is what is really happening. Even the Canadians need to understand. Look, this is a Canadian problem. You and I are not going to fix it. The Canadians will have to kick him out. It's as simple as that, right? If they believe that this is not the right pathway for them, he will have to go. If they think that this is what they choose, if this is their dream come true, then Trudeau is going to be re-elected. I think that's a big question for Canada today. So I think India has used this moment well to make a few Western capitals uncomfortable. Actually, if you really ask me why are the Five Eyes backing out, because some of them are also complicit in many of these activities. So they don't want the spotlight to turn to them. You know, the UK, the US are not clean when it comes to their own engagement with the Khalistani cause in their own countries. So I think they have allowed Canada to take the brunt of the focus, or rather the glare in this particular instance, worried that the spotlight may turn to them. So they are also being calculated in their support of Canada because they don't want to be under the spotlight too. This is a moment when they are witnessing a pan-party support against this in India. You know, you have literally across the party lines a unison, appeal or rather emotion that is united in its dismay and disdain for these activities that are emanating from there. So that's the second part. The third part, why does this happen? And what is the look? I most recently, and this has been written about by others as well, but most recently in Sanjeev Sanyal's book Revolutionaries, since I was doing a book conversation with him, so I had to read that book. And one of the interesting anecdotes that he engages with, and I urge all your viewers to take some time and actually read that book and others. And it will tell you this predates independence. The creating a faction in Canada, a Sikh faction in Canada to oppose the freedom struggle, or to complicate and problematize the freedom struggle in the pre-independence era, has taken a new shape in the post-independence era. But the urge of the Canadians and the British to flirt, or rather it was the British, to be fair, the British in the pre-colonial period, and now the Canadian government, who, by the way, doesn't think that big. For them, it's petty politics. It's like university politics that they fight. Canadian elections are like college elections. So for them, it's like grabbing 5 more seats and 5 more votes and 15, 20 more votes. And it's a small faction. Let's be honest here. Most of the folks in Canada, in the Sikh community, Hindu community, other communities, are against these folks. It's a very small cabal. But that's the nature of Canadian politics. 1,000 votes here and there changes the Prime Minister's fortunes, right? So it predates independence. Dabbling with these extreme elements, with these insurgents or dissidents or whatever name you want to give them, but violent folks who have sought to disrupt India's journey to its independence and thereafter is an enduring legacy of the 20th century. And it has to be tackled. I am glad Trudeau has shown the torchlight or the spotlight on this issue. I hope over the next decade we all in the country as a united nation go after this menace. There should be absolutely no room, no wiggle room given to the Brits or to the Canadians or to anyone else who wants to mess with this, right?
One final question, Samir, on this Canada issue, and that is, over the last 1 year or maybe more, you've seen these threats come in for the Indian diplomats.
Yes.
Particularly in Canada, in UK, in US, and in Australia. You've seen photographs of them planted in posters with "Kill India" written on it. Open, perhaps, bounty being given to eliminate and target Indian diplomats. In Canada, it is going to the extent that Indian diplomats have to roam around with security of the Canadian government. A few days ago or recently, we saw Doraiswamy, India's High Commissioner to UK, being not just denied but almost targeted and heckled and manhandled. The police is investigating this case. How does India tackle with that, and how seriously should New Delhi take this?
Look, again, I think there are a few elements to our response. The first has to be reciprocity. And if our diplomats live in a environment of fear, we should not seek to create paradises for them in India. There should be a very clear understanding that diplomacy is reciprocity. If your diplomats want to have unfettered movement in India, our diplomats need the same ability in your country. So if my diplomats are not going to be allowed access to spaces, I will make sure yours remain within your embassy. So there should be a degree of reciprocity. The freedom to move should be available to all. And if our diplomats cannot go to certain spaces, we must bar their diplomats from entering certain spaces. So we must make it very clear that you get your act together. Otherwise, your diplomats are going to have restricted access in India, and we are going to restrict them to certain zones only. That's the first part. And reciprocity is a good rule to follow. Number two, I think it is time now that, in certain other countries, we start thinking about having our own security arrangements in some of these supposedly safe postings. They're clearly not safe anymore. We used to have a contingent and a whole framework of layered arrangements in Afghanistan and other conflict zones. We have to start thinking about maybe not that extreme an arrangement, but a more sensible and sensitive framework where we protect our diplomats. And it's time to have conversations with these countries that if you're not going to be able to do it, and if you're going to allow a culture of intimidation against us, we will have to protect our own. And we must have that conversation as well. I think a country which will be a very big power in this decade, and certainly in the next 10 to 15 years, needs to invest in protecting its interests. And India's single most important asset are its people. And we must protect them. We must put our weight behind our people. And there must be demonstrable action to show to both the hosts as well as our people that we are doing this. I think it's important to give people the ability to bat on the front foot. We can't have our diplomats defensive in countries where, under the garb of expression, people can intimidate, bully, harass, and perhaps even maim and kill. That is something that is unacceptable in free society. And I'm glad that the Indian Foreign Minister said that freedom of expression does not allow you to intimidate. And we must follow that line. In fact, he has triggered a bigger debate that we must raise now. I think this is time to prevent American-styled absolute expression that is creating conflict within societies and is creating the threat of violence on the streets. I think this whole idea that we'll embrace the American-styled La La Land conversations in a society, in a multicultural society like ours, where we had boundaries of comms, I think that debate also must be had. It's time to push back hard on what is acceptable for much of the rest of the world. And it's high time that the norms that were practiced in 5 countries, or the 5 eyes, or maybe 5 eyes plus their 2 bros, that it's time to make sure that that is over. That a new template for decency, a new template for discourse, and a new template for diplomacy is embraced.
Moving on now to what happened at the Bharat Mandapa. We had a historic consensus, but I was there covering it, and for days together, we had media reportage, particularly again in the Western press, saying that no consensus can be achieved. This will go worse than what happened in Bali. And there suddenly emerged on the very first day Prime Minister Modi saying that a consensus had been achieved, and not just merely a 2-paragraph consensus, but a 37-page consensus, which also included the Russia-Ukraine conflict. How was this achieved?
Well, I can just say that this is in many ways the coming of age of India as a global actor. We always knew India had the convening power. We always knew India could have conversations with the whole constituency of actors. We always knew India could bridge the East and West and North and South. We saw that in action. Those were claims, those were expectations, those were in many ways the attributes we all imagined for ourselves. We did it, and we did it in full public glare. We did it with great in aplomb in some sense. It was, to me, the G20 communique was the geopolitical equivalent of the moon landing, of the successful moon landing. We had a problem. We in some sense failed in our first attempt in front of the world, with millions watching. We went back to the drawing board. We fixed it. We went and landed again in full public glare, the largest viewed YouTube video, I'm told, the moon landing. We did it in full glare, in full scrutiny. That this was the problem, this is the fix, and this is the success. G20 communique was exactly that. Right through the year we saw the inability of various ministerials to come up with a joint statement, and having to settle for chair statements because of the differences on those two conflicts. We fixed it. We spent a month negotiating with the Sherpas. The foreign ministers and others had their own layers of conversations, and in a few instances the top leadership was invoked. But we put together a diplomatic agenda that was really impressive. And again, in full public glare, we didn't wait for the last minute. We did it on the first day. You know, there was no to the wire. It didn't go to the wire. Right? Pretty much the communique was ready before the meeting began. Right? So I think this was in great style. And this was not something that anyone can claim to have been a watered down communique. We had no mention of Russia, but we had a paragraph that was harsh on Russia. Right? So Russia would have would have a pinch point. Europeans would have grouses. But Europeans also got solid action on climate. So the climate ministerial that had failed, or the energy ministerial that had failed to have ambition in it, we saw the communique add ambition to that, right? So we gave something to every group that was seeking positive change in the world. We also were not hesitant in condemning what Russia has done. But also we don't feel it necessary that this is the right arrangement or the right group where peace and security needs to be agitated beyond a point. So we refrained from naming people because this is a consensus organization and a G20 group which focuses on global economic and economic development issues, and we continue to focus on that. So I think the communique was the geopolitical moon landing, coming of age of India's diplomatic temperament. If that was the scientific temperament on display, this was the diplomatic temperament on display. We had to deal with all sorts of folks, including the folks on the sidelines, such as Canada, for example. I mean, they would have. We had a para on terror as well. So I'm sure that would have pinched Canada. Earlier, the terror paragraphs would have hurt Pakistan more. I now believe that Canada feels that it is the aggrieved party, and that perhaps could be one of the reasons why Trudeau went and responded the way he did. Because unknown to you and me, clearly his terror tactics for his political gains has been put under scrutiny.
How significant, Samir, was the inclusion of the African Union as permanent members of the G20? And what does this say about India emerging as a leader of the global South, a term which really makes the West very, very uncomfortable?
Look, I think there are three elements, very important elements. Number one, our growth. India's growth from 3 trillion, 3.5 trillion, 4 trillion to 10, 15 trillion is going to see the emergence of Africa as well. Our growth is going to be linked to theirs. We are going to be the co-travelers in the coming 2 decades. Right? So it is absolutely important that our co-traveler, our development companion, our growth companion is part of any grouping that shapes the future trajectories. That's very important. There is an ethical and moral element as well. How can you exclude that continent from conversations, which is 4 times the size of, say, of the US in terms of just the landmass, and number of people again 3 to 4 times more, right? So you cannot exclude such a vast geography as well as a vast human collective from conversations that will shape their future. So there is an ethical, moral element. And the third, there is a geopolitical element. Their time has come. If you did not do it, someone else would. Why would you want someone else to take the credit for something that comes to you naturally? They are our natural partners. They are our natural companions. Solidarity is a word that binds us. Why would India allow another country to take leadership on doing what is right? So we made sure that we were morally correct, we were strategically correct, and geopolitically we chose the right moment to do it. So I think there was, in many ways, the perfect time to do this, and New Delhi was a perfect location to make it happen. I'm glad Prime Minister Modi grabbed this chance and has in many ways written history, because this is where it happened, right? So truly amazing. And I think in our discourse, we must always refer to this as the Afro-Asian century. It moves Asia away from the east towards the west, where we are going to be growing. And I think that's important. Otherwise, it had been locked in the Asia-Pacific imagination. It is now time to move it to the Afro-Asian imagination. That this is where the Bay of Bengal and the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea and the east coast of Africa and the Atlantic Ocean is where the action moves. more towards the global south than it ever has.
It's been a big win for Modi, that's what you say. But what does this say about the changing dynamics of the Indian foreign policy? A paradigm shift, really. We've had a strategic bilateral cooperation with the US. We have strong defense ties with Russia. We are more focused towards China now, ever since Galwan. We have completely ignored Pakistan. But again, we have emerged as a leader of the global south. We are showing the mirror to Canada. And of course, we had a huge consensus at the G20. How is Modi-Jaishankar's collaboration changing this foreign policy of India?
I think the Modi foreign policy, right, or the India way that Dr. Jaishankar has mentioned in his book, is in some sense a natural progression to India's evolving internationalism since its independence. There is no dramatic departure from what we have always felt was the right way to do things. What the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have done is added steel to it. What we think we should do is what we do now. So the between imagination and implementation, the gap that used to be in some sense vexing India's approach to many of its key objectives is much smaller now. I think we are being able to do what we say, and that is the big change that has happened. It is not necessarily a redesign of how we have approached the world. Non-alignment is now strategic multi-alignment. So it's not as if we have had some major departures in the design itself, but we have A, upgraded them to the 21st century, and B, given steel to it. So we can actually make it happen. We can actually intervene and help countries when they need us. We can actually support certain institutions where they need to do some global public good or benefit certain countries that are important for us. We are adding heft to the design that was always fundamentally sound. I don't think our foreign policy has struggled with having bad design, unlike, say, some of our neighbors, right? We've always had good designs. And now we have good implementation. And I think that is what has happened. Now, between the two of them, we also have another element to the foreign policy. It's more vocal than ever. It's been vocalized. So we had good design, which was unrelatable to people, which could not be explained to people. Between the two of them, we would all agree that Prime Minister Modi, one of his strengths is his ability to put complex ideas in simple ways, so that it matters to people on the streets. It matters to a large number of constituencies who were excluded from high thinking of diplomacy earlier. And of course, one could argue Dr. Jaishankar is the new iconic diplomat of the world today. In some sense, I'm quite sure at some point, like we had Chuck Norris jokes, we'll have Dr. J jokes very soon. So, he's getting to that stage in terms of his status, right? Cult following, if I could call it. So between these two leaders, foreign policy is more relatable to people on the streets. It is being vocalized in a grammar that explains it to people who were left out of these conversations. It has been given heft due to the implementation and the speed of implementation. It also has that element of surprise because of its speed of implementation. So between thinking about something and getting it on the ground and making it happen, that temporal shift of doing business, even in diplomacy, has surprised many folks. That this is a large country, but it's quite nimble, agile, and fast moving. And I think we today have a much faster moving foreign policy. Like I said, no dramatic shift in design. I think our design has been sound, evolutionary, and grounded in who we are, and that remains, in some sense, the continuum. What has really changed is how we made it happen. And today we are making it happen. Earlier, we wanted to make it happen. I think that's the big difference.
Well, that's the big difference. Before I end, congratulations for completing 15 years at the Observer Research Foundation. But we've had these historic developments with the rise of the ORF also, like the Raisina dialogue. What do we expect in the next 15?
Look, I don't know what to expect. I'll just tell you that I was telling someone that when I had joined ORF, India was $1.2 trillion or $1.3 trillion GDP. It is now 3 times the size. And we have grown with it. So I am a big believer in the Indian growth story, and all of us will grow with that story. So that's the point. India has grown 3x. All of us are doing more work. All of us have more targets to chase, more opportunities to map, more ideas to share. We are part of the rise of India. Institutions like ours want to guide it, want to shape it, want to benefit from it, want to explain it, want to create partnerships for it, right? That's the whole purpose. But it is fundamentally a strong, prosperous India integrating and engaging with the world that is shaping destinies of institutions like ours. So we are on the India train, and that's why we wish India all success.
Well, Samir Saran, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aditya. Thank you.